This is your essential business briefing. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up, can our COVID-19 savings save the economy? We'll look at who's been stashing their cash during the pandemic. Lighting the spark for a consumer spending boom. What will make people spend their money and what will they spend it on? Plus, we'll look at how demand for seaside homes has soared here in France, driving up prices in some key locations. It's been one of the unusual aspects of this crisis. While economic activity has slumped during the COVID-19 pandemic, many people's incomes were maintained thanks to government aid. As a result, households were able to save trillions in extra cash. According to a report by Moody's Analytics, since the pandemic began, we've amassed $5.4 trillion of extra savings. That's around 6% of global economic output. The United States saw the most saved, worth 12% of GDP, or $2.6 trillion. More generally, European and North American countries saw the highest savings rates. Here in France, a report from the OFCE think tank estimates that by the end of this year, the extra savings will total €160 billion. It says that if French households spend just 1/5 of that, it could boost economic growth by almost 2 points to 6% next year. So what will turn these savings into spending? Gilles Moëc is Group Chief Economist at Axa, and he joins us now. Gilles, thanks for being with us. Can you give us an idea, first of all, who has been able to save money over the past year? Because it's not everyone.
No, in general, it's the wealthiest part of the population. It's not a surprise. The propensity to save is usually, a growing function of your income. But it's also because wealthier people tend to spend a lot on items which were out of reach last year. For instance, they spend a lot on holidays, they spend a lot on restaurants, this sort of things. So quite a big income inequality when it comes to saving, but again, not unusual. There's also quite a bit of generational inequality. There is some interesting, actually, data in the European Commission surveys about this. It seems that it's the people above the age of 60 who say that they have been able to save the most last year. So to some extent, it's because now in Europe, older people also tend to be wealthier than the average, but it's also because of their, the specific structure of their consumption.
So what's the potential impact on the economy if you can get people to spend the money that they've saved?
Well, basically what we expect in the short run is that when the economy reopens, there's going to be a sort of spectacular catch-up in spending, which is going to lift GDP and growth. What is more complicated to get a good sense of is how much of this rise in saving was just the consequence of the lockdowns, just the fact that we had forced saving. How much of it is precautionary saving, people getting a bit nervous about the long-term prospects. If precautionary saving remains a bit too high, unfortunately, right after this spectacular rebound, again when the economy reopens, consumption could slow down quite a bit. So it's pretty much a question mark. But the first impact, where we can probably expect maybe in Q3 in Europe, if we're able to completely reopen, if the vaccination program goes through, is a spectacular rebound in consumer spending and hence in GDP.
And there'll be many sectors, I'm sure, will be looking forward to that boost as well. Do we have any idea of which sectors are most likely to benefit from that splurge?
Well, what's interesting is that last year, it's the consumption of services, which was really the big victim, actually, of the crisis, quite understandably so. You could not actually spend on many services. So probably there is what's called at the moment, pent-up demand consumption, which has been unable to be performed the last year. And there's going to be a big catch-up. So if we're lucky enough to normalize, for instance, tourism, to normalize hospitality, I guess these sectors would benefit from a massive catch-up in spending in the second half of the year. The same is probably true for cultural activities in general. What went well during the crisis is consumption on goods, and I would not expect actually a big pickup on that.
What about paying down debt? Is that something we're likely to see people use these extra savings for?
Jury is out on this one. What I think is interesting is that in many countries, in many developed countries, we haven't seen actually a rise in personal debt. The corporate sector has leveraged itself quite a bit since the start of the crisis, but the household sector, not that much. And when you look at the net debt actually position of households in many developed countries, they're in a better position now than they used to be before the crisis, because they haven't spent, their saving has increased, and they did not take more debt. So I'm not too worried about that. What could happen, though, is that some households, probably the wealthiest ones, rather than spending their accumulated saving on more services or more goods, would actually choose to spend it, for instance, on buying real estate, to leverage themselves maybe a bit more, to move to a bigger house. We have tentative signs that this is happening. Not all of this additional saving is going to go into consumption. I would expect quite a bit is going to go in the housing sector.
Is there anything that policymakers can do to incentivize people to spend if, when this splurge wanes after the first initial effect of it, is there anything that governments could be doing to help people to sustain that consumer spending a little bit longer?
I'm not a big fan actually of policies which would immediately support consumer spending, because the jury's out actually on the behavior of households when things normalize. And I would rather have governments wait and see actually how much of this accumulated saving goes naturally into consumption. And if we realize at the end of this year, or even in 22, that it has not been big enough, that a lot of this saving glut has remained and people have continued to pile money on the deposits, then it might be worth trying to support consumer spending. The usual suspects, you cut the VAT rate, for instance. It has been done in Germany, for instance, last year. But I would wait to make those decisions, because if you look at Q3 in some countries, Q3 of last year, when we had what we thought was a normalization of our economies, a reopening of our economies, in some cases, the savings rates collapsed in Q3. If you take France, for instance, the savings ratio in Q3 of last year was almost normal. So we may be lucky enough not to need actually policy support. It might be just natural normalization of consumer spending. Let's keep a bit of powder dry, I would say, on that.
The other side of this, of course, is that governments have spent massive amounts of money during this crisis to maintain incomes, which is part of the reason that people were able to save so much. Is there any opportunity for governments to claw back some money as people begin to spend more and economies open up?
Same thing, I would wait. I think that we need to be very, very prudent on our policy stance in the coming year, maybe in the coming 2 years. We don't know actually what is the sort of long-term impact of this crisis on spending behavior. We don't know what's the long-term impact of this crisis on some sectors. For instance, will tourism completely normalize? Will international travel completely normalize, et cetera, et cetera? So just as my point on supporting consumer spending was to say, let's wait a little bit and see how people actually react naturally. The same would apply to actually not reducing the quantum of fiscal support too soon. We have a number of sectors which are very far from normalized. We have a lot of companies which are in a fairly dire situation. Let's keep the foot on the accelerator for a few quarters, and then let's see where we are in, let's say, a year or two from now. But for the time being, I would say let's maintain the current broad policy stance. It's probably true for fiscal and monetary policy, actually.
Okay, prudence all round for the moment. Gilles Moëc, Chief Economist at Axa, thank you very much for speaking to us. As we're just hearing from Gilles there, while some people are dreaming of a holiday when restrictions are lifted, others are thinking bigger and investing in a holiday home by the sea. In certain parts of France, property values have jumped as city residents look for houses with more space to work or relax. Yuka Roye has the story.
The Basque Country, on the border between France and Spain. It's become one of the hottest destinations for city workers looking for a new dream house.
Initialement, on cherchait plutôt une maison secondaire. Et puis en fait, avec le confinement, on a vu qu'on pouvait tout à fait travailler de la maison. Donc là, c'est génial. Là, c'est juste mon bureau qui est là.
More space, better views, and still more affordable than Paris. Whether they decide to stay here longer or just on occasion, a wave of new home buyers has caused prices to rise.
On est sur un appartement de type 2 d'une 60aine de mètres carrés, avec une belle terrasse. On est sur un prix de 360 000 €. ce qui représente une augmentation à peu près 30% par rapport à il y a 3-4 ans.
On average, property prices in France have grown by 6.3% for houses and 3.2% for flats over the past year, according to France's Notary Association. But some areas, particularly along the coasts, are seeing a much bigger jump. Finistère in Brittany is another rising hotspot. It's less glitzy than the Côte d'Azur and the cost of living is much lower. And demand is soaring.
Il y a 15 jours, j'ai mis un bien à vendre. Je l'ai retiré des plateformes au bout de 2 jours, même pas au bout d'une journée, parce que j'ai dû avoir, sur 2 jours, 300 appels.
Out-of-town buyers generally have bigger budgets, outbidding local house hunters.
Les locaux se sentent un peu lésés par cette clientèle, alors qu'on va résumer parisienne, mais c'est pas que, c'est 15-20%, mais c'est aussi des gens du Sud et autres. Les locaux ont tendance à partir sur des villes en arrière, en deuxième zone, arrière littoral.
In an effort to dampen demand, some local authorities have decided to raise the residency tax on secondary homes.
That's it from us for now, but you'll find all of our previous episodes on the France 24 website and as a podcast wherever you usually listen. If you'd like to get in touch with your comments or questions, you'll find me and the team on social media. Until next time, thanks for watching.
By giving sovereignty to Panama in 1999 over the canal that they themselves built, the Americans also gave it back the zone, that strip of land either side of the canal that for almost half a century had lived on American time.
This was a small, artificial country led by engineers, designed by engineers.
Despite the departure of the Americans, certain traditions have remained. And memories too, sometimes bitter memories.
Ya uno se va acostumbrando a oír los tiroteos, la bulla, las bombas que comentan.
Watch The Children of the Canal, Panama Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.